Hello, my name is Julia Volkman, and I'm here to speak with you about the Neuroscience of Montessori. I'm a teaching fellow at Harvard in the Neuroscience of Learning course. I'm also a Montessori teacher and mentor coach, and I run Maitri Learning, a Montessori materials company. So education changes the brain. That's right. Everything we do actually changes the brain, but education in particular changes the brain. And here's a little research study that shows you an example from the LSAT. The LSAT is a test that you have to take to go to law school. And this study showed what happened before you did this LSAT prep course and after the LSAT prep course. Not only did your scores increase, but there are also changes in your connections in your brain. You got more neural connections by taking the course. So this is just one example to show that education really changes the brain. The brain never actually stops changing. And that's obvious because when you see the little baby brain, it's much smaller than the human adult brain, right? It's born with the same amount of neurons pretty much that we'll have for most of our life, but it's shaped by experiences, behavior, and environment. So it's a mix of genes and environment, both interacting to create our brain. So at the neuron level, we're talking about growing connections. And here on the left, you can see all these little black circles are the cell bodies of a neuron. The long skinny lines are the axons. And then these skinny tiny little ones are the dendrites, okay? And these are the connections between neurons. And here in the newborn brain, they're sparse and not well connected. Not much change at 1 month, but by 6 months, you can see a lot more connections. The same number of little black circles, not new neurons, but new connections. And over here in the 2-year-old brain, it's really, really crowded, okay? That's because everything that we do causes connections to grow. Connections, many of them are experience dependent. We need to exert ourselves on the world to grow the connections. Okay. The problem is that these overcrowded connections are actually inefficient. So here, think of it this way. Here's your 2-year-old brain, right, with this really tangled web of connections. It's kind of like a jungle. Like you're trying to get from point A to point B way up there. How are you going to get there? It's like you need a machete. You can like hack your way through, right, to get to where you're going. And that's why it takes little kids forever to do anything, right? It's totally because this overcrowded thing. They're inefficient. You can think of it this way. This little family circus guy, he could have gone straight from there to here. But no, he goes all the way over here and all the way over there and all the way, right. All this crazy route around, which takes him forever to get where he's going. Same thing in an overcrowded brain. So these underused connections are pruned away, and that is a good thing. Here's what I mean. So here we are at birth with sparse connections. Age 7, lots of connections. And age 15, there's fewer connections. What's up with that? Is that like what happens to teenagers? Like they lose their connections, right? No. So what's going on is that the underused connections are being pruned away to make the other connection pathways more efficient. Think of it this way. You're going from a desert, really sparse, to a woodland trail, to a superhighway, right? And that's what we're trying to do through this process of growing and pruning. And this continues throughout life, right? But the pathways we lay down early in life can be strong in service throughout the rest of our lives. We're creating our brain's physical architecture whenever we do anything repeatedly. And this picture is showing you the myelinated axons in a brain. We're building those. We're causing them to be myelinated by exerting ourselves on the world. And the key point here is use it or lose it. And as Montessori said, every unnecessary aid is an obstacle to development, because if we're doing it for the child, we're robbing them of the opportunity to refine their neural pathways. We don't want to do that. No. So in neuroscience terms, we say practice makes permanent. Now, how does this work, this process of practicing and growing information? The late Kurt Fisher, one of my professors, developed dynamic skill theory. And here's how it works. When you're learning something with help, support, or scaffolds, then your learning process is quite different from how it looks when we're just testing it. So here's how it goes. You're here, right? You started today, and now you're learning all this stuff, right? Now you're like learning about the brain, you're learning about neuroplasticity, you're learning about myelin, all this kind of great stuff, right? Okay, you go home tonight and you talk to your spouse. He says, "What'd you do today?" She says. And you look here and you're like, "Well, I learned something about the brain." Okay, so you're down here. You've deconstructed some of the knowledge. But then tomorrow, You watch it again, or you talk with someone about it, and you reconstruct your knowledge to put it back, and you say, oh yeah, whatever you do repeatedly really matters in changing the architecture of your brain. Okay, and then it starts to fall apart, and then it builds up. Falls apart, builds up, falls apart, builds up, until you reach mastery, okay? So this series of progressions and regressions, progression, regression, that's predictable. So when you forget something, don't worry. When the children don't seem to know it immediately the next day, don't worry. That's predictable. It's normal part of the learning process, okay? Now, when we give in the environment, we help them perform at the optimal level. When we're giving them standardized tests, that's not what we see. We'll see them performing at the functional level where they can work without support, without scaffolds. And that's why we'll often see in a test a student comes back with a bad score and we're like, why? I know they're doing great work in the classroom. But on the test, it's an abstract representation of the concept without the support of the Montessori materials, okay? So we see their optimal capacity in the classroom, and the standardized tests show their independent functional capacity. It's quite different. Okay. So as you master a skill, the brain becomes more efficient at using the skill. This is really important. Mastery actually frees up cognitive resources. So here's an example of that. These are the language areas used during reading. When you're 11, you use a lot of real estate. But when you're 38 and you're reading, you use a lot fewer brain resources, right? You have more areas that are free. All of this area is here free to use for other things. So keep this in mind. When you're learning something, you need a lot of brain power to learn it. You use a lot of brain real estate to learn it. And that's why, like, today you're learning so much, you go home and you have like a brain explosion, like, my brain hurts because you're learning so much. That you're using all of your cognitive capacity. That's fine. That's part of learning. But as you get better at it, as you practice, as you learn, you'll use less cognitive resources, so you'll have more available to do other things. You won't get that big brain explosion when you're learning, okay? Okay. Our cognitive capacity is limited. It's comprised of our basic physiologic functions, storage, processing, and buffers, thinking and problem solving, and reserve, right? So what happens if we're really sick or we're stressed? What do you think? The physiologic functions win, and they get most of our cognitive capacity. Everything else gets a little squished. So be mindful of what you're expecting of yourself or the children if they're really sick or stressed. Ask only what the child can give, right? And what you can give yourself. Okay. Some stress is good. This doesn't mean we should be in this like anti-stress environment where everything's just like, do whatever you want, it's okay. No, a little stress is good. It's like when you're working out and you're lifting weights, right? You've got to stress the muscle a little bit to make it grow and to make it stronger. If you stress it too much, you'll tear it. That's bad. That's too much stress. But the right level of stress is necessary for growth. So challenge, you want to keep the right level of challenge for your children so that they can keep growing. Not too easy, not too hard. Now, plasticity is this capacity of the brain to change, and it's easy for the young child to change their brain. It's effortless plasticity. And up here, this side is showing you effort and then age, okay? And this is normal plasticity that's just happening because you exist, all right? Your brain is just, things are happening, experience happens, and your brain changes because of it. You don't have to apply a lot of effort. But as we get older, we have to apply more and more effort to induce those same changes that used to come effortlessly. So this doesn't mean that we can't learn when we're older. It just means we have to try a little bit more than when we were younger, where it seemed to come effortlessly. This is also why it's so important that we give young children as much as we can, because they don't have to work as hard to gain it, and then they can have it for life. Now, a sensitive period is a period where there's a little more plasticity. And there are three main ones that have been studied. And they are the sensitive periods for sensory development, motor and language, and higher cognition. Now, Dr. Montessori lists more sensitive periods. Some of them are subsets of these. Some of them are separate. The big thing to keep in mind here is that a sensitive period is when the brain is more focused on learning or acquiring specific types of experiences. It's like, this is what Dr. Montessori called, you're like in a dark room and the child has a flashlight. They can only see one thing. They're really focused on it. That's what they need to be focused on. And you'll hear it in babies when they first start really vocalizing, and then you're in a meeting, you're Zooming a meeting, and they're going, bah, 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 right in the other room. They're going crazy, right? Because they need to vocalize. They're focused on it. And that exercise of using their developing abilities is how they develop. They have to use it to keep growing. Okay. Effortless plasticity is what happens in the young child, and effortful plasticity is what happens with us. I'm going to give you this example of John Pepper. He developed debilitating symptoms of Parkinson's when he was in his 30s. He ended up regressing terribly, had been an athlete, and was in a wheelchair needing a lot of medication just to stay minimally functional. After decades, his wife made him, I love that, start a gradual conscious walking program. He started, and it was very difficult for him because he could do almost nothing at first. But he slowly increased a little bit every 2 weeks until finally he was really getting strong. It took him 8 years, and he was ultimately able to get off of all of his Parkinson's medications. He's doing well now, living in his later years. So you can watch his video on YouTube to get more information, but I tell you this to encourage you personally in case there are any obstacles that you have in your own life. You can overcome them. The brain changes from anything you do repeatedly, good, bad, or ugly. So if you need to make a change, just start and persist. You will make positive changes in your brain. The same thing for the children. Sometimes we see that they have an obstacle that seems like it's going to be a real problem for them for their whole life. Don't believe it. The brain can change. If we get skillful activity happening repeatedly and continually, things can improve. Exercise is one reason John Pepper had such good luck. Exercise is both neuroprotective and neuroregenerative. Make sure your families know the power of exercise. It's super important. And you yourself, you should be walking at least every day. Okay. Also, though, the other aspect about his program was attention. So he couldn't walk automatically anymore. His automatic functions faded away as his symptoms progressed. He had to put all of his attention on walking. It was very difficult at first, but where we put our attention really matters. And that is a big part of why he is able to function well today. He consciously initiates all of his movements. All right, here's a quick quiz to see if you've gotten what we've covered so far. First of all, we're born with most of the neurons we'll have. True or false? True! About 86 billion plus or minus 8 billion. Like, that's a big variability, right? Okay, humans are not all the same, and that's okay. Next question. Pruning makes neural connections stronger and more efficient, weaker and less efficient, or unreliable? And the answer is stronger and more efficient. Longer and refined connections are more efficient, right? Use less cognitive real estate to do the same thing. Anything we do repeatedly, the brain learns to do more efficiently. True or false? True! Anything we do repeatedly. So if like you get stressed out and you're always like, I just need a little cookie. The cookie helps with stress. Okay, your brain's going to get really good at thinking stress, need cookie, stress, need cookie. Okay, that's bad. But instead, if you can take a little walk or do a little meditation when you get stressed, if you consistently do that, the brain will reach for that and become more efficient at looking for that to solve its stress problem. Okay, next. Just thinking about something is not enough. We have to physically do something to master knowledge. True or false? I might get you on this one. It's false. We humans are continually constructing ourselves based on the things we do externally and internally. Our patterns of thinking matter. So if you're always beating yourself up and saying, I'm the worst person, your brain's going to get really efficient at beating yourself up and saying you're the worst person. However, if you notice that you're doing that, you can notice it, say, not true. I am just a beautiful disaster, just like everyone else, and shift your pattern of thinking intentionally. Your brain will become less efficient at those negative self-talk conversations, okay? Patterns of thinking really matter, and positivity matters as a whole. However, patterns of thinking are not the only thing. It's also this mental rehearsal that we can do. So if you've ever played an instrument or done a dance and you kind of walk through the steps in your mind, you mentally rehearse something, that is actually helpful in mastering this skill. It is not as helpful as actually dancing or actually playing the instrument, but it is still helpful. It activates the same brain regions, but to a lesser degree. So mental rehearsal works. All right, another key point is social cognition. Children tend to pay attention to what we pay attention to. So think of John Pepper here. Where we put our attention matters. We are social learners. Okay, so what do you first look at when you look at this picture? Her eyes, right? Okay, now the second picture, what do you look at? Her eyes, and then what she's looking at, the little mouse. Okay, so first we make eye contact, and then we follow the gaze of others. Our attention is joint. We really rely on others for where we put our attention. And joint attention increases overall attention. So we have several people focused on one lesson, right? We're doing a lesson with the child, they're doing it with us, and then we've got 3 kids around us who are kind of like paying attention too. That joint attention actually makes each of our individual attention better. So when we all pay attention to the same thing, it's a scaffold for the rest of us. Isn't that wild? It's so cool, right? So where you put your attention in the classroom is huge. Think about that, be aware of it. And we don't want to draw attention to negative or unskillful behavior. We want to draw attention to the good activities that are happening in the classroom, right? And here's a picture from Posto School. After a hurricane, they had to reopen their school in a gym because their classrooms were damaged. And they had 6 children's houses, I believe, in one gym. 6! So what did they do? You're like, this is going to be too noisy. It's going to be impossible. No, it was great. The guides were really strict in keeping their attention on the modes of activity, drawing attention to walking softly, talking softly in a fun, encouraging way, and it worked. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. So where you put your attention really matters. If you're always paying attention to the mischievous behavior in your classroom, not that there'll be any mischievous behavior in your classroom, all of the children will also be looking most carefully at the mischievous behavior in your classroom. And they'll become all these little police officers, right? They'll be walking around saying, you're not supposed to be doing this. That's the last thing you want. So if you see police officers in your classroom, ask yourself where you're putting your attention. Draw attention to the positive. Redirect the negative. Overlook as much as you can. Now, sustaining attention generally requires effort. And some children, it's very difficult for them to sustain their attention. Adults too, right? We get pulled away, we get distracted. But if we're super interested in something, it's not hard to pay attention, is it? We've all had this experience where we just get consumed and then we look up and all this time has passed. Like we didn't even eat, right? We really have to use the restroom and we didn't even notice, right? That's called flow. And that's effortless, complete attention. The brain loves flow. And flow is something we see in the Montessori classroom, right? We see it when people are playing an instrument. You get lost in a song. Maybe you've had that experience. We also hear Dr. Montessori talk about it with that little girl who's doing the cylinder blocks and they pick up her table and chair, walk her around, and she's so focused, she doesn't even notice, right? That's flow. Brain loves it. We want to encourage that attention. And we also want to really think about interest and executive functions, okay? Attention is an executive function. It's part of the executive functions overall. And in the little kids, we're looking really at response inhibition, which is also called inhibitory control, working memory, and shifting or cognitive flexibility, right? And these are just developing in the young child. They're not developed yet, okay? They're in process. So sometimes we think the children should arrive and they should all behave well. And if they don't, we're like, he's a bad kid, she's a good kid. That's goofy. They're all actually just developing their executive functions, and it's normal at this age. We can expect it and draw attention to what works and overlook as much as we can of what doesn't work. With this in mind, freedom with limits is the way to help the children train their executive functions, right? The children must be free to choose their own activity, which requires a lesson, right? They can't just be free to grab anything off the shelf. They have to work at their own pace, even if they're slow and pokey and you're like, let's move along. No, their pace. And they need to repeat as much as they need it, okay? As much as they need it. The child is not free to do anything that is dangerous, destructive, or demeaning. Not free. If you see something dangerous, destructive, or demeaning happening, you have to stop what you're doing right then and go and intervene. Make it a safe environment again. However, that doesn't happen that often. Usually we see things that we think are dangerous, destructive, or demeaning, but maybe they're really not, and we're making a lot of judgment about it. So when you're observing and you see something and you're not sure, if it's not obvious that you need to jump up right away, wait. Just keep your attention on what you're doing with just a little periphery on this other thing that's happening. Keep your attention there and finish it so that the children you're working with will benefit from that sustained attention. and then you can go over and intervene as appropriate. Or maybe you don't intervene. Maybe you observe, take notes, and think, what does this mean? What does the child need to help with this? So with that in mind, think about when executive functions are developing. And you can see on this graph, it's mostly happening between the ages of 3 and 6, right when they're in the children's house. It's dramatic. And so they don't come with the executive function already in place. They develop it through this process of interacting and acting upon the environment and of constructing themselves. Now, in adolescence, there's also another big change to executive functions, a little bump there. And the bad news is that I'm a little higher on the graph. So adolescents are actually higher than me. I don't know where you are. I hope it's better than me. Anyway, the executive functions in children and in adults are closely tied with activity. Kids who are more active have more brain power. And this is why movement is essential in the classroom, in the indoor environment, and in the outdoor environment. It's also essential for you as a guide. You need to get enough exercise regularly so that you can be at the top of your game and be a role model for the children. Exercise leads to increases in brain size in areas involved with cognitive flexibility, reinforcement learning, motivation, and memory, right? This is the foundation of normalization. This is really important. So be active and talk to your families about this. If you have a child with some behavior difficulty, speak with the family and see what extent you can increase their exercise. That's often a great remedy. Okay, let's talk about a typical executive function network connectivity, and that's usually up in the front of the brain. Now, you need your whole brain to do anything, but there are certain networks that are used more for different activities than others. The prefrontal network, that's what PFC stands for, prefrontal cortex, and that's this front part of the brain right up there that's involved mostly with higher thinking. So when we're just alert, normal, right now, your prefrontal cortex is active, okay? But let's say you have an acute stress response. Somebody comes up to you and yells at you. Ah, what did you do? Maybe it's like your boss. What did you do? What's going on, right? All of a sudden, boom, things change. This activity in the front of your brain moves down to your limbic system. It moves to your fight or flight, save myself area, okay? And that, you kind of startle, right? You feel yourself go like this. And then if they ask you, what are you going to do about it? You're like, I don't know. And then something comes out. You don't really know if it's intelligent, right? That's because you don't have all of your best assets available to you in that moment, okay? So we are really careful not to trigger an acute stress response in the children or in our colleagues or in the families we work with. So this is the real reason behind our teaching, that we don't correct, we redirect. So when a child does something, uses a material wrong, let's say, we don't jump in there and say, no, do it this way. Instead, at a neutral moment, we say, oh, can I have a turn? Or the next day, we give them a new presentation and show it to them so they can see the proper use of the materials. Don't correct, re-present. Okay, that's a key thing there. Always keep in mind that what gives you an acute stress response may not be the same thing that gives somebody else an acute stress response. Okay, so just be very mindful and observe the children so you understand what they need and don't need. Now, relationships buffer stress. If you're working in a high poverty or high stress environment, this really matters. It's important to have strong relationships with your students and with your colleagues and with the families. It really helps make everything work a lot more smoothly. And some Montessori teachers have this idea that because we're supposed to be not the center of attention in the classroom, because it's all about the children applying themselves on the modes of activity, we are supposed to be a little distant from the children, but that's not true. Having a really strong relationship with them is critical, because while the brain never stops changing, the things that cause it to change, it's not just what we put our hands on, it's also social interactions, all right? This experience includes social interactions. This is key, because sometimes we're in a classroom, we're like, these kids are all just hanging out and talking. Why aren't they working on their work, right? Well, that's for the young child. Talking and social interactions is work, and they need that practice learning how to express themselves, develop a logical voice, and understand that their voice matters, right? Social interactions are important for the brain's optimal development. I'm going to play for you this short little video that talks about serve and return, which is one way of supporting relationships and creating a safe social emotional environment for child development.
built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Wow. So serve and return is really important. Meeting the child where they are, guiding them towards something with our serve, and then returning what they send back to us. Acknowledging what they are experiencing, and then guiding them towards something skillful. Okay? If we want optimal brain architecture, we must have supportive relationships. You can't have one without the other. And these relationships are amazing because they physically change our brain as we adapt to be like the people around us. This is the field of cultural neuroscience, where you can actually see differences in brains based on the culture that you're raised in, not on ethnicity, but on culture. And it's what Montessori referred to as adaptation. It's how we physically change ourselves to be part of our time, place, and group. We want to belong. We are biologically driven to fit in. And so whoever we're around, we try to be like them and learn how to interact with them. That's our biology. That's why we have to be such great role models always in the classroom. And Dr. Montessori knew this. She said, the child reproduces in himself as by a form of psychic mimesis the characteristics of the people in his environment. That's exactly what happens. It's like she had a little MRI machine in her eyes. She just winked out and saw everything that was happening in the brain, because that's what cultural neuroscience does. We adapt ourselves to what's happening in our environment. Now, part of this adaptation involves the mirror neuron system, and here's how they discovered what that is. So this researcher was doing a little experiment with the monkey. The monkey had the little wired up cap on, and the researcher took a break, okay? So he's eating a peanut in his break, and the monkey starts going crazy, because the monkey's like, I want the peanut, right? And the researcher's like, no. And big, strong researcher, smart researcher, what does he do? Sticks out his tongue at the monkey, so, right? And then what happens? The monkey sticks out his tongue back at the researcher. Okay, when they looked at the data, they saw that the same parts of the brain were active when the monkey stuck out his own tongue and when the monkey saw the researcher stick out his tongue. So when we perceive someone else experiencing something, our brain gets active as if we were experiencing it. Now, the implications of this are enormous when you think about what children are exposed to and the importance of skillful exposure in terms of media and real life humans around us. But it's also important for us to understand how we relate to each other and the concept of social contagion. If we're smiling and happy, that rubs off on the children because of the mirror neuron system. And I'll give you a great example of how to think about mirror neurons. You're in, say you're in your room, it's getting close to lunchtime, and you hear somebody in the next room open a bag of potato chips. What happens, right? You're like, that was chips. And then you're like, oh, chips, that would taste really good. And you're like, and they're salty. And then you're like, you're eating the chips. You're not even in the same room as the chips. And it's like you're eating them, right? That's your mirror neurons, okay? That's how they work. When we perceive that someone else is experiencing something, our brain experiences it in a very similar fashion, to a lesser degree, but in a similar fashion, okay? Role modeling, no pressure, right? But role modeling is everything. Okay. Executive function development is actually intertwined with this emotional development. So we're talking about relationships, we're talking about emotions, and a lot of people are like, get your emotions out of learning. You know, learning is just get rid of it so you can focus. No, you cannot learn without emotions. We feel, therefore we learn is the title of a research paper written by Mary Helen Immordino Yang, a friend of mine and a phenomenal researcher in the field. Okay, emotions are essential for learning and they're connected with executive functions. This is amazing. So there's this overlap between executive functions and emotions, right? Younger children are primarily using movement and emotional brain areas to do working memory tasks. That's an executive function task, right? But adolescents and adults use more prefrontal areas. So you can't escape that overlap, especially in the early childhood years. And anxiety at any age reduces working memory capacity. So you can't separate one from the other. They really literally go together. And when we talk about Dr. Montessori's term of normalization, we're actually talking about optimal development. It's really important for us to get away from this guru model of saying, well, Dr. Montessori said X and my trainer said Y, so therefore it's got to be true. No, we are a scientific pedagogy, and that's what Dr. Montessori wanted. She didn't want the method called the Montessori method. She wanted it to be called the scientific pedagogy. That's what it is, and we should use the language of scientists. And optimal development happens on a span, right? And Dr. Montessori has this great graph of normalization where we've got the positive attributes on one side and the less desirable attributes on the other. The important thing to look at in this graph is this middle point here, and right here you have concentration. It is concentration that is the arrival point for skillful optimal development. Once you see a child concentrating, do not interrupt, do not intervene. Let them concentrate, like protect them like they're in a special bubble until they start to develop the ability to concentrate. But it's that first moment of concentration that opens up all the possibilities for the skillful side of the graph. Now, just because we, see them concentrate, it doesn't mean, boom, every day they're going to show up and they're going to be like, perfect, concentrated kids. No, there is variability in all humans at all stages of life. Sometimes we're a little less orderly, a little more capricious. Sometimes we're more focused on work, have more inner discipline, etc. Okay, so there is variability, but we're leaning towards the positive side of this graph, right? Because learning thrives amidst positivity. That's what we're really talking about here. Humans have a negativity bias, okay? But our positivity, we have to have enough positivity to outweigh that bias. Our internal narratives are a really strong factor in that. And internal narratives create physical brain structures. As I mentioned, if we're always beating ourselves up, we get a strong internal neural network for negative self-talk, okay? We need to cultivate our optimism, both personally and externally, socially, right? Because it matters. Positivity and patterns of thinking matter. We have to create this heavier side on the positivity side of the seesaw, because like one little negative event, because boom, the seesaw goes down, right? You need lots of positive events to bring it up so that we're at more of a balance. So our big job in the classroom is to notice the positive, draw attention to the positive so we can develop this optimism bias. It's really important for thriving, and it is contagious. The children will develop it too. So one thing we have to do is reframe our thinking, okay? When we notice that we have the negativity coming up, we reframe it. So here's a pessimistic thought you may have. This politician is horrendous, right? And so you can reframe it. Optimistic alternative. This is our chance to see if the checks and balances in our government really work, okay? All right. Another possible. He totally has ADHD. You kind of dismiss the child, right? All right. Reframe it. His interests are broad. Okay. Do you see how that's true? Right? Here's another one. This child is absolutely out of control. Reframe it. This child is just starting to develop his executive functions. He'll get there. Hopefully soon. Okay, so reframe. The negative is real. We have it and we have a bias toward it, but we need to develop the positive. The negativity bias developed for survival mechanisms, so we pay attention to the negative things because you need to know them so that you don't get, eaten by the bear. So we have to work hard to develop this positivity bias, all right? And inspiration is one way we can do that. Inspiration accesses more brain real estate. This is more research by Mary Helen and Mordino Yang, and it looked specifically at this question of what happens in the brain when people are inspired versus when it's just a standard kind of situation. And the truth is we use more brain real estate when we're inspired. So what does this mean for someone who has a gap? They're having a learning problem, they have a challenge. All of a sudden, if they're inspired, they have a lot more possible places to build a bridge, right? More real estate is available to them. So we build inspiration into the environment all the time. Little true stories that we tell about ourselves, 1 or 2 minutes, a positive thing to orient the children towards the positive. All the time we're doing things like this to inspire them and be inspired by the awe and wonder in the natural world, in the children's accomplishments. If we are inspired, it is socially contagious. It will help the children be inspired. This is so important because inspiration can drive interests, right? And interest can help people overcome tremendous challenges. I'll tell you about this research by Rosalie Fink from Lesley University. She wanted to know why it's true that there is an inordinate number of Nobel Prize laureates who have severe dyslexia. So you think, how can that be possible? And so she asked in her research, how did you succeed in a reading intensive field in spite of your severe dyslexia? And the answer was that they were so interested in the topic that they could overcome and persist. Interest drives learning. So what is the role of the adult with all of this in mind? We have to be a role model of gracious, compassionate, and courteous behavior. We have to recognize and understand what the child is doing, right? So that's scientific observation, so that we can support what is skillful and redirect what is not skillful, okay? No dangerous, destructive, or demeaning. Support what is skillful, redirect what is not skillful. Don't correct, redirect, okay? Here's what Montessori said about her own method. It's really the scientific method. It's the learning sciences. The knowledge of the little child's mental development has to become widely diffused, for only then will education be able to speak with a new voice and say to the world with authority, the laws of life are such and such. They cannot be ignored. You must act in conformity with them, for they proclaim the rights of man, which are universal and common to all. These scientific truths that we've just spoken about, and there are many more, these are those laws of life, and we are learning about them now. It's our obligation to keep growing our knowledge and share it so that we can say with authority, this is how it works. This is why this is good for the child. This is what will lead to optimal development, which will lead to a happier world for everybody where human rights are acknowledged for all. So we have to speak like a scientist. Dr. Montessori was a scientist. We are not in some kumbaya, play your guitar, we're all Montessorians party. No, this is not about kumbaya. This is about science, and we need to speak like scientists. So when we talk about Montessori, we're actually talking about evidence-based education. When we talk about normalization, we're talking about optimal development. When we talk about adaptation, we're talking about cultural neuroplasticity. When we're talking about concentration, we're talking about attention training and flow. When we're talking about deviations, we're actually talking about developing executive functions. And when we're guiding and directing, we're actually serving and returning. And repetition is actually attention training and developing neural efficiency. Okay, so speak like a scientist. Super important. All right, I hope that this has been helpful for you. There are many references here. If you're geeky and you want to go deeper like me, here you sure can. I hope that you will. I encourage you on that path. And I look forward to hearing more from you. Take care.